This afternoon, we're going to be talking about both the fact and experience of exile, as well as the literature of exile. And one of the themes that has come up repeatedly yesterday, as well as today, has to do with the kind of terminology and language that we use. So I think that that's probably something that we'll get into a little bit, but I would like to invite the authors on the panel today to give us a bit of their reflections and thoughts about the subject. No.
Can you hear me now? Yeah. Hello, good afternoon. I suppose the two things that I want to think about is, first one is a definition of what exile might be, because I find the word very problematic, because the word, of course, has in it so many romantic references. And then the second thing I would like to think about is to what extent that condition is relevant to this moment. So one of the first things to say about exile is that it's a catastrophe. It is a break in connections that feed us on so many different levels. And the exile I mean is the exile where you are unable to return. You're not an expat. You're not experimenting with living elsewhere by choice, but you have been, for various reasons, forced to leave and cannot go back. And I'm very cautious here not to speak anecdotally or just like through my personal experience, right? But I will. So this happened to me when I was 8.5, and one of the many problems with exile is that it does distort your ideas about the original place. So one of the damages that it can cause is it can idealize the home country, and I'm afraid I fell into that trap for sure, because for a very long time, Libya, my experience of Libya, just grew more pertinent and more intense the longer I was out of it. It seemed to me in my childhood that I was in very, very little need of translation. I was yet to be constantly or feel myself to have become a host of comparisons, that I'm always trying to navigate something. My childhood in Libya felt very much, and of course the accident is that it was also a childhood, and childhood, at least the childhood I lived, seemed incredibly fluent and incredibly, of course, had in it so many complexities, but I felt very much at home in the world. And we lived very close to the sea, and I felt that the sea was in very material sense. So when I went in and swam, which I did every day, and I had a very unusual way of swimming when I was a child, which horrifies me, just thinking about it today, fills me with panic. So my idea of a swim when I was 6, 7, was that you swim until you can no longer see the land. And then I would close my eyes and spin around myself. and then guess which way is back. And I never got it wrong. I never panicked. I never got it wrong. So the sea felt very much to be a territory that connected me to all these other places, but from which I always knew the way back, the way home. And I remember this very vivid sense as a boy that the water around me was a water that created correspondences with other lands, with Algeria and Greece and Spain and Italy, and that there was this very material connection to the world. Yet I always knew how to get back, and I could always get back. Nothing would stop me from getting back. On top of so many other things that are to do with the social convenience and pleasure and vitality of being surrounded by people that have known you forever and that you have known forever. All of that created such a rich tapestry of variance, and actually made the local incredibly rich in my mind, and made the gesture of flight, of travel, more possible. I was braver, just like I was with the sea. Braver with my mind, braver with my body, with my spirit. The moment we left, we went first to Kenya, and then after that we went to first to Nairobi and then to Cairo. Something broke. It actually reminded me when Javier Cercas was speaking earlier about this moment of a loss of faith and how he couldn't find his way back. I remembered this because it was also one such rupture, one such break, where now my relationship to existence, to the world, to social pleasures, to the sea, everything became much more complicated. I became incredibly, vividly frightened of the sea. So I would swim from the coast in the northern coast in Egypt, which is just an extension of our coast, except it's not as beautiful. This is it's an objective opinion. I would go in and feel a real sense of panic that I think I attributed to this sense of departure. And then it's like that moment, when you're a child and you only know your family, you only know your home, and then suddenly you have your first friend, a person you fall in love with, and you go with them to their family, and then suddenly you realize, oh, there is another family. There's another hope. There's another way of organizing the world. And then this disease of comparison starts to enter your mind. It was a bit like that, because suddenly I was constantly navigating the distances. The Cairene accent and the Cairene ear is so precise. You could live in Egypt for 40 years, have perfect Egyptian accent, and people would know, no, hold on. No, you're originally from where? Where's it? Just something, no, I can hear something else. Egypt is quite, Egyptians are very good at spotting someone who's not originally Egyptian. And so I made it my project to assume the accent in such a way that they can't tell me apart from someone. So in other words, I vanished. I found a way to disappear. And this, the effects of this disease of comparison, or this disease of constantly having to be implicated all the time in translations and finding what something means here and what does it mean there. And at 15, I go to England, yet another sort of migration, this time not only in place but also in language, and I go without my family, and so I'm totally pickled and surrounded by British culture and the English language. And so this has become obviously touched me very personally, but it has also become intellectually very interesting to me. It has implicated me in a whole host of questions and ways of navigating and thinking about the world and thinking about my place in the world. And I feel that since all of this has happened, if anything, the world that I live in has become more and more exilic. So even not only for the obvious reasons because of wars and environmental catastrophes and this very large number of people moving, having to flee, having to leave their homes, of watching constantly ways in how the immigrant is being portrayed, the abstractions that are laid on her and him all the time. But also I feel that even those amongst us who had never needed to leave home, actually, who had lived the most stable, uninterrupted lives, whatever those might be, right? Are also conscious on some level that the world that they're in is not only not the world that they expected, but also it's not a particularly stable world. It's not clear what the future will be like. It's not clear what social transactions, the consequences of them are, you know? So I think a lot of us are being more and more and more touched by this exilic life. Yeah.
Well, I'll start from personal too. And
Can you hear? Okay, I think you're
wait.
Yes.
Oh, okay. I'll start from personal with an irony, because I'm a woman and I'm expected to start from personal, especially in the literature industry. I had to leave home when I was 44, and therefore, and meanwhile, speaking in my mother tongue became such a sentimental experience that I had to cut my ties with it in a way. And I started writing in English for the first time when I was 44, like 8 years ago, 7 years ago. Changing language is a schizophrenic experience. It's a long story, and I can talk hours about it. But what was so interesting when I stepped into English was the use of first person, I. I come from a culture where we don't say I. It is considered arrogance and being immature.
Yeah.
So you disappear as a storyteller, or you disappear as a person, and that shows your maturity. So it took me a lot of time to learn how to say I,
Yeah.
and to learn the intricate art of not sounding arrogant when you say I. It's a British art that, that one has to master. And then I noticed the other challenge is the word exile. Because, like, as if I am carrying a magnet on my name was always accompanied by this thing, exile, the word exile. And for a very long time, for 8 years or so, 7 years at least, I struggled with this word. Whenever there was a piece published, whenever there was an interview, the first thing I said was, don't use one of those photos, I look fat, and please don't use the word exile. This word exile, because I thought the word exile makes me look like this intellectual woman running away from barbarians, throwing herself into the arms of civilized people. So I thought, and I struggled against it. And then it was so late, I realized that it's not for me they're using this word, it's for them. Because they want to feel like the safe haven of humanity, like they're the civilized people. So it's not about me, it's about them. So I really fought against the word, and I constantly said, I'm not an exile. life is a long journey. This is a part of it, you know. And when once you call me an exile, in an abstract way, I can never go back home, because once an exile, always an exile. And then it was 2 years ago, I noticed that exiledom, exilic life, and my personal story actually can benefit the others. Because as you said, when you're finishing your words, everybody's a little bit of exile. Everybody's a little bit homeless in today's world. So our exiledom, or our homelessness, our uprootedness, actually should be a story for others, not a story, a cautionary tale kind of story. But we can think about homelessness as the intersection point of our polycrises. We constantly talk about this polycrises, and so on. Like, you know, we make it so sophisticated and almost impossible to untangle and so on. But what at the very epicenter of that polycrisis, we have to put something there so we can talk about the allyships that I mentioned in the previous panel. So in that epicenter of our polycrisis, I think stands the word homelessness. We are losing home on many different ways. I lost my home because I was a political person, so I went out of the country and then I lost home. That's only one way of losing it. But on another level, we are losing our political homes. Political parties, especially the conventional ones, are no longer accommodating our outrage, political outrage. We are losing the planet, the ultimate home. So we are actually sensing the homelessness every day. When we look at the sea, when we look at the tree, when we look at the birds, when we look at all the beautiful things, we constantly think about their future loss. That we're thinking about the near future that we're going to lose them. So our existence is shadowed by this melancholy of loss of home, actually. And then we already lost our moral home. That's why we have been talking about these topics since the last 2 days. We don't have a moral hub. We don't have a moral home to turn to or connect ourselves to. And then we're losing home, our very existence as humans. We're losing our humaneness in terms of our privilege of being human because of AI. So our humaneness as a home of our existence is, getting away. It's slipping from our hands as well. So there are so many levels. Actually, we are all homeless or becoming homeless. We're all becoming refugees in a way. And of course, millions of people literally losing their homes by becoming refugees, immigrants, exiles, and so on every day. It's getting worse and worse every day. And this is the problem. This kind of homelessness is the problem today that changes the face of politics since the last 1 decade, actually, in the entire Western world. Los Angeles, what's happening in Los Angeles is about homelessness or trying to find a home. And some people saying that this home only belongs to us. So anyway, I've been thinking about these things, and I was writing a book for the last 2 years about home. What is home? Redefining home in 21st century. It's a very long story, and I almost read everything about exile, all exile literature. At some point, I was reading obscure, unpublished PhD theses about exile, refugee, home, concept of home, and everything. But finally, I came to think that home stands at the heart of our polycrisis, not only because we are losing home on many different levels, but also because when you're homeless, all the tragedy, all the catastrophe, as you said, boils down to one question, and it's the question of dignity. How are you going to survive those comparisons, either the ones you make or the ones that are made on you, with dignity? How are you going to survive this life with dignity? When you're uprooted, it becomes a very fundamental question. And then I'm remembering Pope Francis here. I wrote a piece last month in El Mundo, and then it was published in Guardian as well. Pope Francis was talking about dignity. And then I noticed that he's not talking about the dignity of the poor, something that we, have to help poor to protect. He was talking about the dignity of entire humanity. I think our encounter, serious existential encounter, our people of homelessness, homeless people, our encounter, serious existential encounter with the concept of dignity can tell a lot to the rest of the world about how their dignity is damaged as well. So I started from personal, but I think this is also a very political question, a moral question, and I think it's about everybody's homelessness. So our personal catastrophe, and I can even call it, we are the people of apocalypse, actually. We are you in future tense, because you're going to lose your home too. So we are going to tell you what you're going to do, how you can survive this period of homelessness with dignity. When I stepped into English, intuitively, because of the use of the word exile, because they were constantly asking me about my personal story, like how I suffered in Turkey and so on and so forth, intuitively, I developed this reaction. And the reaction was, I'm not talking about myself. I'm going to talk about you. I'm going to tell your story to you. I'm not talking about myself. But now I noticed that reaction was also a reaction of a broken heart. Now I'm a little bit more at home in this world after 8 years in this language. I can say that let's tell our story together, and let's make a story of home together. Because we're going to, in the very near future, we're going to end up in a world where we're going to lose the sense of home on every layer I mentioned earlier. So we will have to build a home with words and with people. So our experience as early survivors, let's say, previous survivors, could only be a stepping stone for the world to learn how to live or how to rebuild home in the 21st century, I think.
Hearing both of you talk about this notion of homelessness, it reminded me there, during one of the panels yesterday, Reverend Spadaro spoke about, on the one hand, there are the stories that are the epic collective narratives, and that he had noticed a shift toward individual stories. And, there's this notion of the theory of the novel that Lukács put forward, which is that there is a distinction between the classical epics, which stem from settled cultures, essentially, and the novel, which is a response to the world in flux, which he called a kind of transcendental homelessness. So that notion of estrangement, I guess, being there from the very beginning in terms of people trying to grapple with all the changes happening around them. And I was wondering, in terms of both of you, if that's something that you think while you're working on your own work, is that something that you think about? Was it something that you even thought about even before? Well, I guess, Hisham, this was something that you've experienced for, most of your life. But I was wondering about that question of the connection between literature and estrangement and alienation, and whether there's something, first of all, you're very right to point out the catastrophe, the sheer catastrophe of literal exile and banishment, essentially. But also, is there something that can be taken from that? Is there something that can be generative in some way?
That's a very, very good question. Absolutely. It's both a catastrophe and an insight. It's both of those things. And of course, obviously, within the Abrahamic tradition, the original story is a story of exile. And I think literature is metaphysically, has always been fascinated by this question of of exile. I mean, it's yesterday I spoke a little bit about Abu al-Ala al-Ma'arri's episode of forgiveness, in which a poet is thinking about who was it that wrote the first poem, and he goes into the underworld, and he goes also rises to the heavens in search of this of an answer to this question. And the answer that one of the answers he comes up with is very much an exilic answer. You know, one is the first poem was written by Adam about the past, and or was it written about Eve about the future? You know, so this relationship of the moment you sit down, I feel, and you write, and I feel this much more acutely with prose. Prose is much more invested in, or you could say much more hampered by time. That whatever you whatever sentence you put down, you're suddenly in time. And suddenly there's a sense of something that has happened and something that might happen. So it's forever invested in this. But then all of these foundational texts are constantly thinking about the metaphysical dimension of what we're talking about, to such an extent that it makes me wonder whether a literal exile is so profound, not only for all the obvious reasons of it being painful and a rupture and so on, but also because it awakens in us this root knowledge of what it might be like to be a human being, right? Mm-hmm. So you get it. I mean, we're in Rome, so I'm going to allow myself some license. You know, one of the foundational texts, exilic texts, was written by a man who, although he wasn't from this town, he lived here, Ovid, and when Ovid was exiled, and we don't know why he was exiled. The only explanation we have actually comes from him, and it's Carmen et error, a poem and a mistake. That's the reason he was cast away. And he writes this text from his exile, and he sends it back as a book that returns in his place. You know, and it's a fascinating book. It's a book that has fascinated me for a very long time, one that I reread and I find so interesting. And not actually, I don't find it so interesting because of its references, say, to my own experience. Not at all. It's more because I think it alights on something really essential about our relationship to language and place and time. And it opens with the lines, this is, of course, I mean, this in some play, I mean, I should be shot right now to be reciting to you Ovid in English translation in Rome. So it's like there's got to be a rule against that, you know. But it opens with something like, little book. No, I don't begrudge it you. You're off to the city without me. On your way then, but penny planed as befits an exile's sad offering, and my present state. For you there will be no slipcase in purple, that's a color that goes ill with grief. No cedar oil backing, no white edges to set off your black letters. Appear for inspection briskly, unkempt, and if in the throng you should come upon one who should chance to ask about me, don't say he's well. Say he lives by the grace of the gods, for the rest remain silent. So he gives all of these explanations. He dresses up the book, sends it back, asks it to be an ambassador for him, tells the book very precisely what to say and what not to say, right? But of course, the book doesn't hold its tongue. The book gives him up, right? And that, I think, is also something about what we're talking about, that, you know, Juan Gabriel Vázquez yesterday mentioned that something quite, I think, provocative, that there's a separation between the novelists and the novel. The two are separate entities. And in a sense, this is also an example where the text departs from Ovid's will, finds its own energies that even Ovid can't hold back. So I think the subject, of course, we are talking about is very pertinent. It's to do with specific historical features but I think it's also something metaphysically very connected to the nature of literature.
So since you talked about Ovid, I'm going to embarrass myself by talking about Dante and the exilic literature. While I was reading this history, this pantheon of exiles, I noticed in the literature of exile, there is a thread, so to speak, or perhaps that thread attracted my attention because of the fact that I was thinking about dignity. The first person who actually talked about dignity of the exile was Dante. And he said how hard it is to climb the others' stairs and how salt is the water. You're going to know how hard it is to climb the stairs of the others, and then how salt is the bread. I cannot even quote in English. So years, centuries later, one of the giants of my language, Nazım Hikmet, wrote exactly the same sentence. And he is not a thief, so I think he didn't steal it. He just thought of the same thing without knowing that Dante actually wrote the same thing. And he said how difficult it is to constantly climb the stairs of the others. And then this dignity, it's like an arc. Several people talked about it. Dignity becomes important in the literature of exile because you are given two options, two literary voices. One, the suffering exile, and second is the glorious survivor. There is nothing in between. You cannot be normal people in exile, especially when you're writing. So who actually noticed this impossible paradox and who attacked this paradox was a South African poet, Breyten Breytenbach, who was also in exile. And incredibly, and while I was in this pantheon, I was lost in this pantheon of literature of exile, he was like this almost Clint Eastwood to me. He literally felt like I felt like he said this to me. And he wrote once, your evaluation of dignity is wrong. And now you are walking on a tightrope of your own creation, and your only audience is you. And this was the quote that actually inspired me to write the book that I just finished about home. So in literature, we imagine literature as this space of freedom, space of opportunities, and many voices and so on. For exile, there's only two roles that you are supposed to play. And the third role, that if you want to be none of this, then that's a challenge. And that's not only a literary challenge, but also a political challenge, moral challenge, philosophical challenge. So, yeah.
So before we get to questions, both of you brought up something that I was also thinking about, which was the question of the so-called romance of exile. I mean, Hisham, you mentioned the actual catastrophe of exile, which both of you have experienced. And there's two kinds of romance, I guess, that I identify. There's the one that you talked about, Hisham, which was the romance of the exile for the homeland, the sort of idealization of what was left behind, what was lost. And then Eja, you've talked a bit about the romance of the exile, the person, the figure of the exile, the way in which everybody wanted to identify you with that because it fit with a picture in their minds of what exile meant. And
Nisreen said auto-orientalization. You are forced to do that constantly. You have to orientalize and romanticize your suffering and so on. They love it especially in France. They love it.
Yeah. And is that something that, because when I think about the romance of exile, I guess I also think of a very particular time, for instance, during the Cold War, especially, that because, a number of exiles fled to the West, fled to the States, to England. I think there was this notion of the sort of fearless dissident who could no longer practice his or her work, his or her writing in their home, and that the West would be the place where they would be given the freedom to do that. And so I think that there was this notion of romance attached to that. And I was wondering if either of you had any thoughts about this. We do have actually to go to a Q&A very soon, but if anybody has a...
Yeah, I mean, like they were used as political signifiers. Sorry, I jumped in. Political signifiers in a more blunt way. But we, as I said earlier, people like me are used as political signifiers as well, because there is no longer Europe in the sense that we know in 1960s, 70s, that Europe is disappearing. But if we are exiles, taking shelter in this Europe, then that Europe must be there. So we are the proof of that Europe, of that West in more broader terms. So it is romanticizing, but it's actually a political process that is happening there. So same thing happens in a more sophisticated way today. Yeah.
I mean, I was just thinking as you were saying that, Jennifer, that there's a line from Edward Said's essay on exile, where he says that exile is a jealous state, that what's earned in it, you don't want to share it because it was so painfully earned. But I would say that it's also actually, yes, of course, a jealous state, but I would also say it's also a generous state in some sense. And it's subject to, and I would argue it's subject to this response from, I've seen it from different cultures. I don't think it's just from Europe. I've seen it also in other parts of the world. It's also subject to a particular kind of positive and negative superstition. That either that as an exile, you have a romantic response to it, that you've got something to tell us that is somehow not only new and interesting, but on some level we carry the superstition or hope, depending how you feel about it, that it is essential to our sense of being a human being. That I think we suspect, and I'm not sure whether the suspicion is well founded or not. In other words, I'm not sure it's not appropriate, right? Is that we suspect that somebody that has been through this experience has something to tell us, not only about what they've been through, but who we are. So that's a sort of what I would call as a sort of positive superstition. And then the negative superstition is the obvious one. It would disrupt our state. It would disrupt the illusion of solidity and belonging. So I think both of those things are present.
Okay, so we're going to take it to questions. Yes, Safwan. Hello.
Thank you. So when you mentioned catastrophe the first time, and we're talking about exile, immediately what comes to my mind, catastrophe, Nakba, right?
Yes.
1948, and even though both of you talked about exile and individual level, I wonder to what extent do you think about, or to what extent do you relate what you're saying to mass exile? The 800,000 who were ethnically cleansed in 1948 from Palestine, the ongoing ethnic cleansing that's going on. And you're talking about sort of the things that remind you of home and the water when you're in. I think about the house keys that they took with them and that they passed on to their descendants. So it's a different kind of exile, but probably with some intersections. I just wonder what either of you think about in that.
I was in Beirut in Ain el Hilfa when Palestine officially applied for statehood in UN, and I watched it with the Palestinian refugees at the time. And this was the first time I couldn't go back to my country. So it was ironic. I was with the oldest homeless people of the world, and this was the first time I really felt homeless. I couldn't go back to the country. And I thought it was just an insignificant thought then. Now in hindsight, I understand that it was a defining moment in my life, because for the first time I thought that, oh, it's my turn now to be homeless. And now, as I said in the beginning, it will come to everybody for different reasons, but everybody will be homeless. So everybody will have to learn from Palestinians how to stand with dignity, how to bear, how to stay human, how not to hate the entire humanity, even that entire humanity is watching them die, starve. So that's why I think you are right. Hisham, it must be a generous position. And we are seeing that generosity from Palestine today in incredible, absurdly generous way. They do not hate humans. They don't. I don't know why. They don't need. They don't hate the world. They still have faith in the people. They're still appealing to humanity. So their homelessness, together with mine, together with Hisham's, and together with millions and millions of other people, should be a story. Not to tell people that you're going to lose your homes as well, not to terrify them, but to create that new home. We have to find another way of doing home, making home, so that we don't lose it like we do right now.
And it's poignant that you bring up Beirut, right, where they have been refugees for 80 years.
Exactly.
Right? And they continue to long for a home.
I think, one of the things that that is has been painful for a very long time is that not only are we spoken about as the terrorists, the nonsensical, the ones that scream and cry, and these endless catalog. I mean, I don't even know how to account, how to impart the effect of growing up your whole life being subjected to images of yourself on the media that are incredibly narrow and distorted. It does something to your soul. So not only is that upsetting for all the obvious reasons, but of course it stands in place of the other things that aren't told, such as the incredible sort of poise and dignity and courage with which such a fate is met, right? So one of the things that I find incredibly moving these days is that, and this might not come through in translation, but all of the various interviews done, or the press isn't allowed to go to Gaza in a free way. In fact, it's actively punished and targeted. But these videos that people capture on their phones and ask one another questions, one of the things that has always been very, very profound for me is that at the end of the account, so someone would, usually the format is very similar. So somebody would say, so old lady, what's happened to you? There's a woman crying. Old lady, what's happened to you? And she'll tell her story. I lost my son. I lost my all of my children, my house, And then at the end of these accounts, whether it's a child or an old person, or man or a woman, they would always end with the same thing. They would always say at the end, Alhamdulillah, thanks be to God. It's very powerful because it's an antidote against revenge. It's an antidote against self-pity. But it's also a great act of dignity and pride showing. There's a wonderful short story that now read from this perspective is so darkly and powerfully prophetic by the Palestinian writer Ghassan Kanafani. Ghassan Kanafani writes a story called Letter from Gaza. I'm sure a lot of you know it. And it's written as an episode, this short story. It's very powerful. And in it, he describes, at one point, the narrator describes Gaza as being part of the limb of the body of his niece. His niece is blown up and she loses her leg. And he describes the territory in that sense. And I think that's a very, very powerful parallel, because in a sense, our first and last home on this earth, at least, is our body. This is our location. And to make a parallel between this, the human body where we are located, and the land, is a very powerful gesture that happens in that story.
Yes, toward the back.
Thank you so much for this wonderful panel, for the panel that preceded. I came here with the hope of becoming a better writer and a better teacher. I teach anthropology of religion and other topics at Georgetown University in Washington. And I had a very strange experience last semester with my students, who are my greatest source of inspiration and growing. So we explored the topic of the wounded healer, the idea of the wound that we discussed. And I was really puzzled by the idea that the students could not accept the fact that the wounded healer can heal only if he can stay in the darkness, because that same darkness and that same suffering will heal him, her, them, and also other people. But I were like, we want to heal, but we don't want to suffer. We don't want to see that darkness. And we had to go through a lot of storytelling to make them accept the fact that darkness and suffering is necessary to heal. And it's that place of discomfort that you mentioned, right? That we don't wanna deal with, right? So, but even in writing, I think that darkness is one of the greatest source of inspiration. Last Sunday, I went to visit Antonio Gramsci. I don't know if you know that he is here in Rome, the cemetery of the A Catholic Cemetery.
Wow, I didn't know that. Good
Yeah,
that you told me.
He is here, so I went to visit him on Sunday, and I was like, we need you so badly. What you will say, what you will write, and probably he will write the same thing, exactly the same thing that he wrote so many years ago. But here the question is for you and to all the writers here. How did your darkness, those moments of suffering and pain, help you to write? What was the role and power of writing, of imagination, of stories in your creative process? So how can we talk about the wounded writer?
I think, when you say darkness and all these big words, I have this urge to be radically humble. And I think it's time to refer to Pope Francis once again. He was a man of humor. And when we say darkness, I think we are overestimating. It's personal catastrophes, personal apocalypses, and so on. I was laughing, by the way, because Tash, now he left. He came to me in the afternoon and he said, "You just said to someone, I lost my everything when I was 44. Ha, ha, ha. Why do you laugh about it?" And I said, we cannot take this seriously. We cannot take ourselves so seriously. To be honest, I'm now 52. I cannot take people seriously if they do not self-mock. They do not, mock themselves. So that darkness, we are the children of Freud. We take this darkness thing so seriously. We should be the children of Frankl, who was another Holocaust survivor, who once said, actually, it is humor that will heal us. And that's an ancient wisdom, I think. And laughter, as Pope Francis said, there's this revolutionary thing in laughter. And once Walter Benjamin said that laughter is the best trigger for thought. So we have to use laughter when, especially in absolute darkness. Palestinians would know this. All Middle East would know this very well. Latin American would know this. So yes, how do you do it? You just laugh at yourself and get on with it. This trauma thing, people, especially young people, they are used to taking themselves so seriously, but they don't realize that makes the problem unsolvable, and trauma become their identity, and it becomes eternal, perennial. So we have to laugh about it, and together, not each other, but together we have to laugh about it, this darkness. That's how I survive. This is how I do it.
I'm not sure what I could add to that. For me, writing is praise, really. It's a form of praise. Not praise in the sense of saying this is good, this is how it should be, but praise in the sense of acknowledging. I think one of the ways that makes sense to me, one of the ways to be in the world is to name it. So praise in that sense. You name it. You say it exists. You don't say it's good or bad. You just say it exists in some sense. And if you do it honestly enough and well enough, then you don't even have to offer any commentary, because you have faith that people would arrive at it in a similar way or in their own way, So to me, making art is one of the deepest, not expressions, but activity in praise and in love, a word that was mentioned earlier, So I'm much more interested in that. I think that's what I'm enlivened by, if that makes any sense.
I think, do we have questions? One more question? Okay, Tom.
Thank you, Hisham, Eche. Wonderful conversation. I wanted to come back to the tension, I'll call it a tension between exile and homelessness as a lived reality and as a broader metaphor. You've spoken eloquently, you've both written eloquently about the lived reality, and we don't want to downplay that. People actually uprooted and the pain and suffering that entails, the insight that entails. But as Eche, you mentioned, we're also in a fast-moving world where homelessness is taking on other coloration, mediated by technology, the ubiquity of technology, human relationships no longer as direct as they once were, and now increasingly our interactions with machines displacing those relationships altogether. The tech elite that you mentioned in the earlier panel dreams of fleeing this human reality, is unmoored from it, even colonizing other planets. How far can we push the metaphor of homelessness, and how does it relate to the reality of homelessness?
From our political position, like I'm literally talking about the people in this room and perhaps the ones listening online, we will have to make a choice in terms of home. Probably some of us, not here perhaps, but people like us, some of them will choose to be, mini gurus of these very rich people, and so that they have a free ticket to their bunkers. Religious people or academics or writers, artists, and I saw some of them, by the way, doing this in that retreat, some artists literally doing this, schmoozing with the rich people so they can have a room in the bunker. So this is a reality. So it's not a metaphor. That's what I mean. So we are going to make a choice, I think. And this is not a metaphorical thing. We are going to we'll have to do this. Either we're going to home ourselves in their bunkers, or we're going to be homeless with the others and still believe that we can build a home together with the poor, with the powerless, and so on. Yeah, it's not a metaphor. It is. So I was talking to homeless people when I was writing this book, like lowest of the low, especially if you are, living in staying in a shelter in Germany. That means that you slip through all the security nets. You are just really like zero in life. What I noticed is they have this incredible sense of survival, and these people are mostly mentally ill, but still they know how to survive in a city. And when you're homeless, a city is a different thing. It's a jungle, and you only have few people to depend on, and your entire day becomes waiting for those people to come to you. And you have to show gratitude. And it's a different kind of life. And they're surviving this, and they're trying to do this with dignity. All my life, I was trying to do this. There's this hierarchy of knowledges, and what professor knows is so important, whereas the homeless guy who is like half mad does not, his knowledge is less important. Can we do this? I think Pankaj said this, the professors or intellectuals and the illiterate come together. Can we do this? Because really, they have a lot to teach us. For instance, these fires happened in the United States, right? Overnight, people were homeless, like literally homeless. So they had to learn in overnight how to live like a homeless person. They needed another homeless person he was a professional at the situation. So it is real, actually, what I'm saying. It's not metaphor. I want that. I want these two knowledges to come together to build a new home where these two knowledges feel at home. I think we can push that metaphor really, really far as an answer to your question.
Well, I think, Hisham, or I guess this was we've been given the stop sign.
Yes.
Thank you so much. Thank you
Thank
to
you,
both of
Jennifer.
you.
You're amazing.
And thank you to all of you for being here.
Thank you.